In the quiet town of Fairfax, Virginia, under the cloak of a moonless night, two police officers pulled over a lone driver. What seemed like a routine traffic stop quickly unraveled into a web of deceit and corruption, as the officers were unaware that their target, Ava Sterling, was not just any woman. She was a seasoned CIA operative. Ava Sterling drove through the suburban streets, her eyes scanning the familiar route. As she approached an intersection, she noticed a faint glimmer of a stop sign hidden in the shadows. Her instincts, honed by years of undercover work, told her something was amiss. She came to a full stop, her hand steady on the wheel. Moments later, the piercing wail of a siren shattered the night silence. Blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror as a patrol car pulled up behind her. Officers Ethan Davis and Lucas Miller stepped out of their vehicle, their movements deliberate. Davis, the taller of the two, approached Ava's window, his flashlight beam sweeping across her face. "Good evening, ma'am," Davis said, his voice laced with practiced authority. "You know why I pulled you over?" Ava met his gaze, her expression neutral. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." Davis's lips twitched into a condescending smile. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there. That's a moving violation." Ava's brow furrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm certain I stopped, officer." Davis interrupted, his tone hardening. "License and registration, please." Ava handed him the documents without hesitation, her movements slow and deliberate. Davis examined her papers, his eyes lingering on her license. "Virginia plates, local address," he muttered, then louder. "You live around here?" Ava nodded. "Yes, officer." Miller, who had been lingering near the rear of Ava's vehicle, suddenly called out, "Davis, you might want to take a look back here." Davis straightened, passing Ava's documents back without comment. "Stay in the car," he ordered, before turning to join Miller at the trunk of her SUV. Ava watched them through her side mirror, a flicker of unease in her chest. Miller pointed at something, his voice low and conspiratorial. Davis nodded, and the two officers exchanged a glance that sent a shiver down Ava's spine. Moments later, Davis returned to her window, his expression grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Ava tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Davis replied, his tone clipped. Ava's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances? I think you've made a mistake." Davis gestured for her to exit. "We'll see about that." Suppressing a sigh, Ava opened the door and stepped out, her movements unhurried. Miller theatrically lifted her trunk, revealing a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. "There it is," Miller said with mock surprise. "A bag of powdery goodness." Ava's eyes flicked to the bag and then back to the officers, her face unreadable. Inside, her mind raced, cataloging every detail. The bag hadn't been there when she left her house. This was a setup. As Davis moved closer, his smirk widening, Ava allowed a faint smile to curve her lips. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Miller pause for half a second before snapping the cuffs into place. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," Davis said, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Ava gazed out the window, her mind already spinning through her options. The two officers might think they had just scored an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the station was shrouded in tense silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Ava sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression neutral. The fluorescent glow of passing street lights painted fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. Inwardly, her thoughts were sharp and deliberate, every moment of the encounter replayed in her mind like a puzzle being assembled piece by piece. At the station, Ava was processed and placed in a cold, dimly lit holding cell. She sat on the metal bench, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet corridor. Officer Davis lingered for a moment, watching her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said conversationally. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she said, her tone calm but laced with an edge that made Davis shift uncomfortably. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Ava leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew her next steps had to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom, she was about to expose something much bigger. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Ava waited, her patience born of years in the field. She knew her absence would be noticed soon enough, and when it was, there would be questions. Her team would find her. They always did. In the meantime, she had to play the part of the calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. But every passing moment was another opportunity to observe, to gather information. She noted the footsteps of the night shift officers as they passed her cell, their routines and patterns. She listened for the faint beeping of the station's computers and the crackle of the radio. Every detail mattered. In the station's break room, Davis and Miller sat back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Miller said, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic?" Davis smirked. "Yeah, well, that'll change. She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to dig too deep." "Besides," Sullivan added, "we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Back in her cell, Ava closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours ticked by, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute was another step closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The storm was coming, and Ava was its quiet eye. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of Ava's holding cell, casting a muted glow on the cold concrete walls. The faint hum of voices drifted from the hallway outside her cell as the station came to life. Ava hadn't moved much during the night, sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed as if in meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. Her mind was sharper this way, constantly calculating, anticipating. The loud buzz of the cell block door being unlocked echoed down the corridor, followed by heavy boots echoing down the hallway. Ava didn't flinch as Officer Miller appeared in front of her cell, holding a clipboard and wearing his usual smirk. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "You sleep okay? Or was the cot not soft enough for you?" Ava met his gaze without a word, her silence unsettling him more than he'd care to admit. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing down at his clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Ava tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "Good to know," she replied softly. Miller frowned, the confidence in his smirk faltering for a split second. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before turning on his heel and walking away. Ava leaned back against the wall, her gaze following him as he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. All she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, young and eager, watched Miller stride through the station. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with Keller. He had processed dozens of arrests in his few months on the job, but this one felt different. Ava Sterling hadn't acted like anyone Keller had ever seen. She wasn't defiant or aggressive, but she wasn't scared either. Her calm demeanor, her deliberate words, they weren't normal. And then there was the bag of drugs, sitting right there in the trunk like a gift-wrapped package. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He knew the unwritten rules of the station. You didn't question senior officers. But the doubt gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. As Keller wrestled with his conscience, Ava made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were trained on the camera positioned outside her cell. It was an old model, likely outdated and poorly maintained. The station's budget, she guessed, didn't prioritize state-of-the-art surveillance. She waited until the hallway was clear, then shifted slightly on the bench, her movements deliberate but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. She pressed her hand against the fabric, triggering the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. She didn't need to speak or explain. They would know what to do. In the break room, Davis and Miller sipped their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're going to crack," Davis said, shaking his head. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." Miller chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Davis leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. "You know what I like about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter echoed through the room, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their understanding. At a nearby office, a nondescript phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out to answer it, the voice on the other end calm but authoritative. "Signal received," the voice said. "Location confirmed. Deploying resources." Ava leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. She could almost feel the gears turning, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no joy, only quiet certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. The station bustled with its usual morning activity, officers filing reports, answering calls, and exchanging pleasantries over coffee. It was business as usual for everyone except Ava Sterling and the two men who had orchestrated her arrest. For Davis and Miller, today felt like a victory lap. Ava sat motionless in her holding cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she could see the edges of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation. But she remained focused, knowing how to blend into the background when necessary, to make herself invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago, and she trusted her team implicitly. But she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to sow the seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller's eyes darted toward the holding cell monitors again. Ava hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't fear or defiance, two emotions he was accustomed to seeing in detainees. It was patience, a quiet confidence that seemed misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Unable to shake his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license information and address were straightforward, but there was an unusual gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as an independent consultant with no further details. Frowning, Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room where Davis and Miller were laughing over donuts, their carefree demeanor making his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to take a closer look at the arrest report, clicking through the digital records. He scanned the narrative provided by Davis and Miller, stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, exhibited nervous behavior during questioning, consent to search granted, controlled substances found in the trunk of the vehicle. Something didn't add up. He'd been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and while the report followed procedure on the surface, it felt too tidy, too scripted. Keller's internal conflict grew as the hours passed. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Ava's cell with increasing frequency. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Sterling," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Ava looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes?" Keller hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Ava tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the faint cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Ava replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Davis and Miller, they rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face flushed, and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Ava saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Fairfax, a plain black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was flanked by two other agents, their demeanor professional and alert. "ETA on extraction?" one of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Ava in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk where Keller was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed. "Good," the man replied. "We'll use it when the time comes." In the break room, Davis leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You see Keller earlier?" he said to Miller. "Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost." Miller smirked, shaking his head. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jumpy around the first big case." "Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions," Davis said, his tone darkening. Miller shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there, and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Davis nodded, but a faint flicker of unease crossed his face for the first time. He considered the possibility that Keller's doubts could be contagious. As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to rise. Eyes darted toward Ava's cell, and whispers echoed through the corridors. Ava could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She knew her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Keller sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the edge as he stared at his monitor. The digital file on Ava Sterling remained open, the words blurring as his mind churned. He felt a knot forming in his chest, a sensation that had been growing since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He glanced toward the break room where Davis and Miller were still laughing, their carefree attitudes grating against his unease. The station felt heavier than usual, the walls pressing in like a silent witness to something unspoken. Keller's thoughts wandered back to the holding cell, to Ava's words. That's what they're counting on. Her voice had been calm, deliberate, as if she knew exactly what buttons to press. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubt turned into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. His reputation as a rookie already made him a target for teasing. Any signs of insubordination could isolate him further. He waited until Davis and Miller left the room, then slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Keller logged into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for past cases tied to Davis and Miller. Their names popped up repeatedly, attached to arrests that followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color, and most were convicted. The knot in his chest tightened. Back in her cell, Ava remained still, her body a picture of composure. She had spent years training her mind to thrive in moments like this, when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past her cell, his pacing slower now, his steps more deliberate. She could sense his conflict, the internal war waging within him. He was close. She knew it, close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Davis and Miller relied on. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her movements catch his attention. He stopped, turning to face her. "Officer Keller," she said, her voice soft but commanding. He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the wall as if it were a lifeline. "What?" he asked, his voice low, almost defensive. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Something that doesn't add up." Keller swallowed hard. "I can't. I'm just trying to do my job." "And what is your job exactly?" Ava pressed. "To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong?" Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes darting down the hallway. "You don't understand how things work around here," he said. "I understand more than you think," Ava replied, her gaze unwavering. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice. But you do, Keller. You always have a choice." Keller walked away, but her words followed him like a shadow. He returned to his desk, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He stared at the list of cases tied to Davis and Miller, his stomach twisting with each new name he read. Finally, he made a decision. Keller opened a secure email channel and typed a message, his fingers moving faster as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found along with a note. "To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it or if they would even care, but it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Davis leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting on his knee. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked, glancing at Miller. Miller shrugged. "Kids are always weird. What's he going to do? Rat us out?" Davis smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." That afternoon, as the station hummed with activity, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the lot. Inside the car, Ava's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email exactly as planned, and now had what they needed to proceed. "Let's make this clean," the team leader said, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside." As they stepped out of the car, the sun glinted off their badges. FBI. Inside her cell, Ava smiled faintly as the door to the station opened and the agents walked in. She couldn't see them from her vantage point, but she didn't need to. She knew her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. The hum of the station fell into an awkward silence as the front doors opened. The agents stepped inside, their movements measured, their black suits crisp and their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The one in the lead, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk, his eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Officer Keller, seated nearby, froze mid-typing, his heart beginning to race. He wasn't sure if it was fear or relief or both. He watched as the lead agent leaned slightly over the desk, speaking low enough that the surrounding officers couldn't hear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice wary. "Federal investigation," the agent replied, his voice steady and clipped. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive even, but there was no protocol for outright denial. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew deep down that the email he'd sent had triggered this, but he hadn't expected a response so soon or so visible. His gaze flicked toward Davis and Miller, who were standing near the break-room door, their laughter having died, replaced by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. Davis's eyes locked onto Keller for a split second, and the rookie quickly looked away, focusing on his screen. The air in the station had changed, thick with a tension that felt almost suffocating. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled a cart carrying a portable server and several hard drives. They wasted no time plugging into the station's network and beginning to sift through its digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. "Anything?" he asked the tech agent, a younger woman with sharp eyes. She nodded. "Plenty. Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This isn't just bad policing. It's systemic." Price's jaw tightened. "Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two." In her cell, Ava heard the faint murmur of activity beyond the hallway. She could feel the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting on her lap. The cuffs she'd worn earlier had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she didn't pay them any mind. Her focus was on the moment ahead, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. In the break room, Davis paced back and forth, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Miller leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching his partner with a growing sense of unease. "You think this is about her?" Miller asked finally, his voice low. Davis stopped, glaring at him. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "You think they know?" Davis scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. What, there's nothing to know? Everything we did was by the book?" "Yeah," Miller muttered. "Sure." Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two other agents. He carried a folder filled with printed reports, the weight of evidence in his hands. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable, as he approached the bullpen. His gaze locked onto Davis and Miller, who froze mid-conversation. The agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. "Officers Brandon Davis and Mark Miller," Price said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We need to speak with you." Davis tried to play it cool, forcing a smirk as he stepped forward. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." The room fell silent as the agents led the two officers toward the same interrogation room they had occupied moments earlier. Keller watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Davis's facade, the tension in Miller's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked more like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Ava's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral but his tone respectful. "Miss Sterling, you're free to go." Ava stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As Ava passed by Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, the words caught in his throat. She stopped, turning to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Davis and Miller, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Ava watched from the station's entrance as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Davis and Miller sat at a small metal table, their postures stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. "So," Price began, his tone measured, "do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Miller flinched, his eyes darting toward Davis. "We don't know what you're talking about," Davis said firmly, his voice laced with defiance. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a series of printed photos. He slid them across the table, one by one, images from the station's security cameras showing Davis and Miller holding the unmarked bag before Ava's car was searched. Davis's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Really?" "Because these timestamps show otherwise, and we have audio recordings courtesy of Miss Sterling's hidden surveillance device, capturing your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Miller paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that. It's entrapment." Price smirked, shaking his head. "No, it's justice, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under review, but let me make one thing clear. You're not walking out of here today." Davis's bravado began to crumble, his shoulders sagging. Miller buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally hitting him. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching the scene unfold. He had been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. For the first time, he felt the heavy gaze of Davis and Miller as they realized someone from within had spoken out. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Agent Price, clearing his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Price looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Now we clean house. And you did the right thing." Keller nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Ava stood near the station's entrance, watching as Davis and Miller were led out in handcuffs, the once smug officers now looking defeated, their eyes downcast as they were escorted past their colleagues. The station buzzed with quiet murmurs, officers exchanging stunned glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Ava, his expression neutral but respectful. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Ava nodded, her composure unbroken. "Good. Make sure it sticks." Price smiled faintly. "It will." As Ava stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The weight she had carried for weeks began to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation sent shockwaves through the town. Davis and Miller's arrests were headline news, their faces plastered across every screen. The charges against Ava were formally dropped, and the cases tied to the officers' misconduct were reopened. The station underwent a massive overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he had made the right choice. Weeks later, Ava sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting down beside her. Ava smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And missed the look on their faces?" "No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For Ava, the storm had passed, but the impact of her actions would ripple on, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Davis and Miller's arrest, every local and national outlet had picked up the story. "Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Fairfax," read the bold headline on one major news site. Footage of the officers being led out in handcuffs played on a loop, their faces grim, stripped of the arrogance they had worn so openly. Ava Sterling's name was kept out of the media intentionally, a calculated decision by her team. The focus needed to remain on the systemic issues at the station and the actions of the officers involved, not on her role in uncovering the truth. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in fame, only results. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Davis and Miller sat across from their lawyers, their arrogance having melted into desperation, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The charges against them were overwhelming, falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Miller muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything. Audio, video, the files. What do we do?" Davis, usually the more confident of the two, sat in silence, his jaw clenched. "We fight it," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was weak. But their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Back at the Fairfax Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations revealed more officers involved in similar practices, and resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, emphasizing a commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Keller found himself at the center of attention, both praised and ostracized for his role in bringing the corruption to light. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact, while others quietly expressed their support. Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Ava met Keller in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Ava raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation." Keller looked down at the table, his expression conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way. But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Davis and Miller, there are more of them out there." Ava leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "It made a difference to the people they hurt, and it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you? What happens now?" Ava leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Davis and Miller stood in court, their fates sealed. They pleaded guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Ava sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. The phone on the counter buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Ava smiled faintly. "Always." As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. And that, for her, was enough. And so, the truth came to light, and justice was served. The corrupt officers who thought they could get away with their crimes faced the consequences of their actions, while the woman they tried to frame emerged victorious, stronger than ever. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through.